Good morning. Thank you so much, Christopher, for that wonderful introduction this morning. It's such an honor to be with all of you this morning. Now, you might not be able to tell from my accent, but I didn't grow up in Chicago, nor your beautiful village of Winnetka. But I did spend many of my happiest years as a boy in Greenville, South Carolina. And guess what? As Christopher told you, I attended Christ Episcopal Church and was the head acolyte. When I first met Christopher, I was drawn to his passion for spreading the love of Christ and for his ambitions for this congregation and thinking about life and love in different ways. It was also comforting that he too seemed to love fried food and gumbo as much as I. It's pretty daunting to be asked to kick off your new fall season of Christian education, but it's a bit easier when I can see so many caring friends and smiling faces in front of me. And to Gabrielle, thank you for introducing me to this beautiful church and for sharing your life with me over this past year. I'd like to ask if you would pray with me for 1 second. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. It truly is an honor to be here with you and to have the privilege to share with each of you the events of a most remarkable day in my life. For the next few minutes, I'd like you to forget that you're sitting here with your families and friends and join me on Flight 1549, leaving New York's LaGuardia Airport and bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. I was flying home to meet my family along the South Carolina coast for a long weekend and to spend a little time with my 7- and 9-year-old nephews. As you hear this story, I hope that you'll think about your life, the nature of miracles, and mostly about God's love. I was in New York City for several meetings, and before going to bed the night before, I remember hearing the weatherman say that tomorrow is going to be the coldest day of the year with possible blizzard conditions. But I had my warm overcoat and my gloves, so I knew I'd be just fine. All morning in the city, the wind and the snow were howling. But just before I got into the car to head to LaGuardia, things cleared up. As I arrived at the departure area, I remember asking the driver about the weather and remarked that I couldn't believe how it had cleared up so suddenly. He smiled and said that he was surprised as well, and it looked like the storm was gone for good. This was going to be a great day for flying. Clear skies and cold air, which were perfect for the jet engines, and I shouldn't have any problem making my connection in Charlotte to arrive at the beach in South Carolina in time for my favorite sweet iced tea and fried chicken dinner. How could life get any better? After a slight delay, we boarded, and I took my window seat in the rear of the plane on the left-hand side. Normally, I prefer the aisle, but this would be a short flight to Charlotte, and since the weather had cleared, I would have a fantastic view of the Manhattan skyline. We took off about 30 minutes late and began our ascent away from LaGuardia and heading south. I admired the beautiful view overlooking New York and settled into reading the newspaper. After reaching about 2,800 feet and a little over 100 seconds into the flight, bam! An explosion occurred. The plane shuddered and dramatically slowed. As I looked out of my window, the image most vivid is the left engine completely engulfed in flames. No sparks or tiny fire. Instead, a bonfire of flames that leapt off the wing. My engine was burning. Welcome to U.S. Airways Flight 1549, and now you are in seat 25A in the back of the plane. We continue to climb for another 400 feet. There's a strong smell of jet fuel throughout the plane. I'm not entirely sure that we don't have a fire inside. The flight attendant in the rear of the plane tells everyone to remain calm and that everything's fine. I can't see what's happening on the right side of the plane, but clearly everything is not fine. As we reach an altitude of nearly 3,300 feet, the plane banks very slowly to the left, and we seem to be headed back to the airport. I remember thinking, I'm not sure I'll make my original connection, but I should get to the beach in time for that chicken dinner. I can see the runway from my window as we head back toward LaGuardia, but then we stop turning, and I realize that we're heading down the Hudson River. We are slowly descending and decelerating, but in a controlled manner. As we pass over the spans of the George Washington Bridge, I realize that the captain is protecting himself. Clearly, we're not heading back to LaGuardia, so he must be trying to get to another airport to land. The fire from my engine continues to burn out of control, and it's clear that we have very little power. But I'm not sure about the engine on the right side and assume we have some power because we're still flying. As we continue to descend, my mind begins to play tricks on me. We must be heading to Newark Airport since it's further downriver. But at our altitude, I'm not quite sure that we can make it. And then I remember that I had once visited Ellis Island near the Statue of Liberty. And while I don't remember a landing strip on this tiny landmark, maybe they've added one that I just don't know about. To this point, the pilot has said nothing, and the only sounds on the plane are a few occasional gasps and cries among the passengers. As we continue to descend down the river, our pilot, Captain Sully Sullenberger, finally comes on the loudspeaker and says the words that you never imagine you'll have to hear: brace for impact. Now, I'd like to ask each of you to do something that might be a bit uncomfortable, but since you're sitting in seat 25A, pretend that you have just been told that in 55 seconds you'll be crashing into the Hudson River, and based on aviation history, it's probably your last minute on Earth. I'll let you ponder your own life for just a few seconds. It's awkward, isn't it? Those 55 seconds were most amazing. As an athlete and a huge sports fan, I immediately thought, 20-second timeout. This must be some kind of dream. The pilot couldn't have just said those words, because brace for impact really meant prepare to die. 3 things happened to me in those 55 seconds that will stay with me forever. The first was that God and I had a most wonderful conversation. Actually, it was mostly me talking while he listened. I remember thinking, I've had the most extraordinary 49 years, and how grateful I was to him for the many incredible experiences that he had given me. And I knew that if he needed me, I was ready, that my life was truly in his hands. Candidly, I must admit that I did say, God, if you're asking me, I'd love another 49 years. But that decision didn't really seem to be in my control. The next thing that happened was shocking. I'd heard stories of similar experiences, but suddenly, many of the most beautiful and exquisite memories of my life played in my mind, as though I were watching it on the big screen. Images of my mom, my dad, my sister, the 2 little nephews, lifelong friendships, winning the football state championship, and I think probably kissing a few pretty girls. To me, it was worthy of an Academy Award. And for the final 20 seconds, my survival instinct kicked in, and I realized I'm sitting in the back of the plane, on the window, and it's a long way to the exits on the wings. My only shot is to get to the door in the back galley. I reached under my seat, but I couldn't get my life preserver to budge, and then decided I wanted to know exactly when the impact with the river would occur. The flight attendant was yelling, "Brace, brace, head down, head down." As I looked out of the window and the water came closer and closer, I just didn't understand how having my head between my legs was going to work out positively. It was clear that either I was going into the seat in front of me or it was coming back into me. So I chose to crouch down with a hand on my seatbelt and my eyes on the water so that as we hit the water, I could relax my body as much as possible. One of the lighter moments occurred as we were about 300 feet above the river and passing a boat on the left-hand side. There was a man on the deck, and I couldn't help but wondering, what in the world is he thinking as a jumbo jet passes him at eye level and is about to crash into the Hudson River? I still remember hearing some of the passengers crying. Some were praying aloud, and a few were eerily saying, "I can't swim, I can't swim." As we hit the river, I exhaled and held on tight. One of the things that saved my life was the genius of Captain Sullenberger and his ability to maintain the proper airspeed as we descended. Too slow, and we stall and fall from the sky. And too fast, we have no chance upon impact. At about 200 feet above the river, he lifted the plane's nose, and we made a rear belly landing, which knocked a hole in the bottom of the plane near me and detached the seal from my window. As I looked out of the window, all I could see was dirty water. I wasn't sure how deep we were, but we popped up, slid along the water, and dipped again before severely tilting to the right. As it turned out, the impact had knocked the left engine of the plane off so that our weight was all to the right side. All I could think was that we were going to clip our right wing and be catapulted into a million pieces, or have the plane turn upside down. Neither option seemed very good. Stunningly, the wing did clip the water, but instead of turning over, it allowed us to fishtail and come to a stop with the nose facing Manhattan. I couldn't believe that I had survived the crash, but within seconds, the water was rushing through the window and up through the floor bottom. 4 or 5 of us quickly headed to the back, but with the water rising rapidly, we couldn't get the rear door open and were forced to turn around and look to the front. This might have been the most frightening moment, because as I looked forward, there was simply no way out. The aisle was jammed with people trying to exit, and the 35-degree water had risen from my ankles to my neck in about a minute. No matter what, I really didn't want to drown. My only shot was to try to climb over the seats, and I started on the right side against the windows of the last row. Normally, I would have been hurdling each row, but with the water up to here, I couldn't get any traction, and I had to pull myself over each seat and fall back into the water, only to repeat the process until I reached the wing and an open exit. I was so excited to think that maybe I was going to make it out, but a woman and her young child were lodged in the window, trying to get onto the wing. After helping them, I moved across the aisle and finally saw a clearing through that exit. Unfortunately, there was no room on that wing, so I either had to knock someone off or jump in the water. Instead, I climbed over a few more seats and then heard a wonderful yell from the pilots that I could come out of the front left exit and jump down into the raft. That was the first time I truly thought I was going to make it out in one piece. Within seconds, the co-pilot and Captain Sullenberger jumped down next to me, and I leaned over and grabbed Sully's arm and said, "Thank you. You saved all of our lives." He smiled and just said, "You're welcome." I remember asking the co-pilot what had happened, and what did he actually think when he knew we were ditching in the Hudson River. He told me about hitting the flock of geese, and then he paused and said, "I thought the outcome would have been much, much worse." I sat shivering in the raft for about 15 minutes before we were rescued by a ferry and taken to the ferry terminal for several hours of waiting and some medical attention. The next morning, I appeared on the Today Show with Matt Lauer and then flew home to the beach. And after hugging my mom, I got to stop at Bojangles for my favorite chicken and biscuit. I think my question for you today, do you believe in miracles? One of my agnostic friends said, "It's just a string of coincidences." And I remember telling him, how many coincidences constitute a miracle? Is it 3, 5, 10? I'm not sure how many miracles occurred that day, but in my heart, I know that there were at least 12. An interesting number, don't you think? How many things had to go right for me to be standing here before you today? The water temperature that day was 35 degrees. The next day, there were chunks of ice on the river. There had never been a successful water ditching in which everyone survived. The crash happened at 3:30 in the afternoon. 2 hours later, it would have been completely dark, and Sully's depth perception would have been impaired. Plus, inside the plane, we would have been in complete darkness trying to get out. At that moment, there was very little traffic on that part of the Hudson River. The usual barge traffic would have made a landing almost impossible. After blizzard conditions all morning, suddenly the storm had cleared out and the water was as smooth as glass. Instead of the plane breaking up into pieces, it floated for 24 minutes before sinking. Water was rushing into the cabin in the rear, and yet it stopped right here, just as I thought I'd run out of air. The rush hour ferries were all operating with maximum crew availability. Sitting in the raft for much longer in the 16-degree weather would have been disastrous. We happened to be in New York City, which was prepared for almost every emergency. Our extraordinary crew had 3 brave and experienced flight attendants, all over the age of 50. My pilot was extraordinary. 57, a fighter pilot, calm and confident. Most importantly, a glider pilot with over 19,000 hours. He made all the right decisions. And finally, the plane's wings were completely full of jet fuel, which allowed for maximum buoyancy. Normally, in an emergency, the pilot dumps as much fuel as possible. He just didn't have the time. How has faith played a role in my life? We all experience disappointments along the way. People hurt our feelings. We want a certain grade in a class. We want to make a certain team. Sometimes we lose jobs that we need or that we love. And sometimes we even lose people close to us. Over the past 2 years, I've lost several good friends and even some of my relatives. It's hard, and I've been quite sad, but I know that God has a plan. Often, I may not completely understand it, but I trust it, and I trust Him. When a door closes, another opens, and amazingly, it seems to be for the better. The hardest part for me about faith is just not knowing. I've always been impatient and always wanted to know, what's the answer? What's next? Where am I going? Guess what? I've learned that I'm not always going to get that answer. There will be things that happen that anger me or that I don't fully understand. But the comforting part has been to learn that God doesn't always make things crystal clear to me. He may have a few twists and turns in the road that I didn't fully understand nor see coming. I could spend the rest of my life wondering, why was I on flight 1549 that day, at that hour? Why were these geese flying at that altitude and at that second? But as I've learned to accept them as His will, it's made all the difference in the world. Each day is a gift. There are no promises for tomorrow. With certainty, we only have today. Everyone asks me the same question. did I think I was going to die. It didn't look so good. But I felt that if God wanted me or needed me, I was ready. In the end, he clearly wasn't ready for me. Psalm 23 was quite comforting. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. I said to God, if you've decided that this is my time, it's okay. It was peaceful and almost tranquil. God may take me tomorrow. If I have a say, he'll give me those extra 49 years. But that's not my call. What is my call is to believe that he has a plan for me, wants me to cherish each and every day. You will have setbacks, things that you may not understand. But when things are unclear or hurt, just ask God to help you and to comfort you in the ways that he deems best. Have faith in God, because he definitely has faith in you. I firmly believe that God has no problem with questioning and wondering, and I absolutely think he wants us to wonder, to debate, and maybe even to disagree. If we were ever given an 11th commandment, I think it might read, "Thou shalt not be afraid, if you always have faith in me." Every day is a miracle. Some days they're just bigger than others. On Thursday, January 15th, 2009, God's grace brought about many, many miracles. Do you believe? I leave you with the message that I know Jesus had for me that day as I came out of the airplane floating on the Hudson River. Onward, Christian soldier. Now, I need you here. When the time is right, I'll come for you. Until then, live every day to its fullest and know that no matter how dark things may be, how steep that climb, I will lift you up. All I ask is that you believe in me. We never know where life's twists and turns will lead us. Isn't it wonderfully ironic that I'm currently producing a musical for Broadway based on the songbook of Sammy Kahn and Jimmy Van Heusen, in which my favorite song happens to be "Come Fly With Me." Celebrate the wonder of being alive today, and think about this question when you go to bed tonight. If you were arrested tomorrow for being a Christian, would they have enough evidence to convict you? I hope that in my remaining time, I can build a mountain of evidence. And remember, one day, your life will flash before your eyes. Make it worth watching. Thank you for sharing my story, and may God bless you each and every day. Amen.
So here's what I want you to focus on. 55 seconds left. Brace for impact. What Billy heard was prepare to die. I want to be the rector of the church that shapes and forms you so that the last 55 seconds of your life, you're at peace. That's my job. That's our work. And we start now. You get to bring everything with you that you've had up to this moment in your life. But that's our work. The last 55 seconds of your life at peace. You're smart people. You understand that you can't start with 55 seconds left. You've got to practice. You've got to want to do that today and every day, one day at a time. And so everything we do here at Christ Church from this day forward will be designed to help you be at peace the last 55 seconds of your life. Now, it's one thing to be inspired, and this is a very inspiring story, and the way Billy sees this through the lens of the Savior, literally, his Lord and Savior, and Sully Sullenberger, his Savior, is very, very inspiring. But when people are inspired, it's not enough. After you're inspired, you have to have a plan. And so the cornerstones upon which we will build this peace, the peace of God, which passes all understanding, is this. The cornerstones are worship at Christ Church more than you don't. Be involved with some kind of Christian education that allows you to deepen your faith and practice. Be involved with some kind of Christian service. Service you do because Christ invites you to. And the fourth item, make a proportionate gift to the spread of the kingdom at Christ Church. A proportion of the money that you receive from your work and life designated for the work of the kingdom, the spread of the kingdom right here. Now, over the next 4 weeks, I'll talk about each of those four things individually. And there's plenty of room inside of those four for you to tailor something that suits you best. You'll get lots of freedom to figure out how those cornerstones work for you. And if they're not the right number, and if you need less or more, then you'll be free to do that. But the point is this. Your life here at Christ Church is designed for you to be at peace the last 55 seconds of your earthly life. And my job, and the job of the staff, and of the vestry, and of all volunteers here, is to help each of us receive that peace which comes from God. It's going to be a very exciting fall, and as soon as I heard Billy's story, I knew that this was the peace that we needed to move forward in this direction. So, Billy, I can't thank you enough for such a moving story, and I know that you've been that you've offered to answer questions briefly for about 10 minutes. So I'll ask you to move back to the pulpit and allow people to ask anything they'd like to. Yes, David.
Billy, can you tell us a little bit about what parish life is like at your home parish?
What is parish life like in your home parish?
Well, having grown up in South Carolina, I also have I grew up in Greenville, where Christ Church I attended for so long, probably 20 years. And then I now have a home on the coast in a little community called Pawleys Island, South Carolina, where I spend more of my time. And All Saints Parish is there, Waccamaw. It's extremely, they're beautiful parishes. Obviously, the one along the coast is a little different than the one in Greenville, which is much more traditional, has probably been there over 100 years. I notice interesting things. We haven't had a chance to talk about it, but when you attend different services, there are little things that always stand out for me, which is which prayers are said, which prayers are unsaid. You'll know, Christopher, but one of my favorite prayers is the "We do not presume to come to this thy table," the humble access prayer, which some churches do and some don't. I always find it interesting to see when certain people stand and when certain people kneel. So to me, those nuances, but I think the wonderful part for me as an Episcopalian, having grown up, is that no matter where I have gone, I gave this talk to a church in Aspen last year. And I had a really incredibly moving, I might have shared this with you, Christopher, really moving experience there, which is the woman who had been the lay reader, whom I had never known, obviously spoke before I came and gave the sermon during the service.
This was at the Episcopal Church in Aspen.
In Aspen. A beautiful little church that maybe holds 200 people. After I'd given my sermon during the offertory, she came up and tears were rolling down her cheeks. And she came up and hugged me and said, "I just want to tell you what your speech meant to me." And I was obviously very flattered. But then I was completely knocked out when she told me that about a year and a half before that, her son had committed suicide. And that until that day, she had brought some friends from Midland, Texas. They were from Texas, that her friends had had a similar experience, and they had not been back to church until that day. And so I've told Christopher a story. There's one last thing I'll share. I don't really like talking about this. As you can tell, there are times in this story that no matter how many times I've given it or how many questions I've been asked, it's very emotional. And I try to fight through that a little bit. I did an okay job this morning. I didn't do a great job, but I fought through it as much as I could. But what's happened that has really touched me is how many people are here this morning, or Christopher asking me to speak, and the fact that this story is so relatable to so many of us, because I bet everyone here, or 80%, have flown out of LaGuardia Airport. And you know what that flight's like, and you know what you're looking out the window and how magnificent things are and how quickly your life could change like that. So to me, the power that I think, and maybe one reason why the Lord wasn't ready for me, was that I've been able to share this story, and maybe it's touched people's lives along the way. But it's been really wonderful for me with the Episcopal community, that how many times I've been asked to talk in Episcopal churches. I hope I answered your question.
Yes.
Did you fly home?
Did you fly home?
Again, part of the fun part of the story is that I was on my way. I'm a Southerner, and I hope I don't offend anyone, but I'm a duck hunter. So I was on my way home for the long weekend to go duck hunting. And I was desperately trying to get home because I had friends that we were meeting and going to go. So I actually probably would have gone back late that night, but I used to be the president of Discovery Channel, Discovery Networks in Washington, and I had done a number of documentaries, and Matt Lauer had hosted one for me. So when Matt Lauer called me personally and said, "Would you be on the show tomorrow morning?" He had helped me, so I really felt like I could help him. So I did the show, got my stuff, and got on the plane, and a really fun story happened as I was flying back. It was the exact same flight the next afternoon, 24 hours later. So I got on the plane. Someone had asked me earlier, I think maybe Jim had asked me, did they refund your flight? And I said, I'm not really sure, but they upgraded me the next day. So I walked into the plane, and I stuck my head in the cockpit, and I said to the pilots, I just want to make sure you guys have checked for geese today. So they knew I was coming, and they kind of smiled and said, we're all clear, no problem. So I sat down, I was on the window, sat next to a gentleman, elderly gentleman that we had some mutual friends from Charlotte, North Carolina. And we were flying. About midway through the flight attendant leans into me and says, Mr. Campbell, I just want to make sure that everything's okay. You okay? And I kind of smiled at her and I said, thank you so much, I'm fine. So I was curious if you were sitting next to me. I haven't spoken to the flight attendant. I haven't asked for a Coca-Cola, nothing. Why is she asking me that? So the gentleman says, what was that all about? I said, well, I think she was just checking after what happened yesterday. He doesn't know what happened yesterday, so he said, well, what happened yesterday? So I said, well, you know, I was on the plane, you know, and he said, well, which plane? So I finally said, well, I was on the plane that crashed into the Hudson River. So he had immediately he kind of gasped and goes, oh my gosh. And then he pauses for about 5 seconds and he gets this big smile on his face and he said, this is going to be the best flight of my life. There's no way that you're going to crash 2 times in a row.
One or two more. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering if you see any connection between the role of the geese and the fact you're on the way to a duck hunt.
I've been asked that question before, too. I will share something with you that was difficult for me along those lines. So I was living in Los Angeles at the time. I was kind of commuting back and forth and working on this musical. And so I'd been back in LA, and I think the crash, I'd stayed with my family for about 10 days or 2 weeks after the crash, and then I headed back to California. And I'd been out to dinner with friends. I think it was on a Friday night. And I came back, and it was around 10 o'clock at night, came into the house, turned on the TV, and I think it was on a news channel, but immediately, all that was on the news channel was that a plane had crashed in Buffalo, New York. I don't know if you remember it. It was a Continental plane that crashed in the middle of, it had ice on the wings, and it was so shocking to me after what I had been through. And then as the story unfolded, everything about it was pilot error. You know, those people could have been alive if the pilot had actually not even touched the autopilot. He overrode the autopilot and did everything wrong, and 50 people died. And I sat there, and it was emotional. Why? I didn't understand. Why was my plane Why were 150 of us okay? Just because I was lucky to have Captain Sullenberger on my flight. And so I don't know how to answer that. I think your point, Christopher, early is that often there are no answers, which is part of what I hoped my message to you was, is there is always one answer, which is God. And if you will trust him, he'll do what's right. It may not be what you want. It may not be what you think is right, and it may be painful. But if you trust him, it'll be okay. My friends kid me all the time about that geese thing. And I really have mixed feelings when I see geese now when I'm kind of riding around and they're all congregating. But I try to stay away from them.
We've got one last question. The girls here from Sunday school would like to ask a question. How long were you able to keep your head above water?
What's your name? Ellie? That's a great question. I think the lucky part for me, Ellie, was that my head was always above water because, again, I think it was one of the miracles that God stopped the water right here, and it never went any higher for about 24 minutes until the plane sank, which gave me time to be able to get out. Another question that people ask me all the time was the water really cold? And yes, it was. But I have to say that the first time that I noticed that the water was cold was when I was sitting in the raft, and I was shaking. And the other kind of a little 13th miracle really was everything that I had, my computer, my clothes, my bag, every single thing was gone. I had on a suit similar to this, which was soaking wet, and maybe one reason why I still carry a BlackBerry. I had a BlackBerry in my pocket, which had been wet, but it was dry enough to allow me to call my mother, to say, who was driving to pick me up, to say, I just want you to know when I was in the raft that I've been in a plane crash and I'm okay. And of course she was like, what? But I didn't want her driving and hear it because I knew it would be on the radio and that no one would know. So there were so many little things that happened. The interesting part is the people in the front of the plane and the people in the back. If you heard someone tell this story today, which is the way life is really, I don't know if you know a movie, there's an old movie, a Japanese movie called Rashomon, which is about 7 different angles to a different story. People in the front, including Captain Sullenberger, he never had any idea we were underwater until it was all over in the back. People in the front, I ran into a friend of mine who was married to a girl from my high school who happened to be sitting in first class, and I run into him in the ferry terminal. I go, were you on this flight? And he's just sitting there kind of reading the newspaper, completely bone dry. So my story was completely different. I happened to be sitting in the back. I was really, really fortunate because that water stopped long enough and at a level enough that I could continue to breathe, and it allowed me the time to get out. That was a great question.